On the morning of August 29th, 1988, a stocky man with a size 21 neck and gravel for a voice walked out of a house in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn and started toward his car. He had tattoos on his knuckles, one hand carrying the word true and the other carrying the word love. And he had spent approximately half his life inside a secret that he had never disclosed to the men who would eventually kill him and had never fully disclosed to the men who were supposed to protect him. He had known, with the precision that comes from 19 years of living inside two simultaneous identities, that the morning he was walking into might be the morning he did not walk back from. He had been warned of this explicitly. He had been offered a way out. He had declined. His name was Wilfred Johnson. The people who had known him from the streets called him Willie Boy. The FBI called him Wahoo. And John Gotti, the man who had ordered his death, had been the closest thing to a friend that a man in his world could call by that word, a friend he had protected in every significant way except one, and the one exception was the thing that had been slowly narrowing the distance between Wilfred Johnson and a Tuesday morning in August for 19 years. The story of Willie Boy Johnson is not a simple story of an informant. Informants choose a side. Johnson had not done that. What he had done was something more complicated and, in the end, more costly. He had maintained two simultaneous and completely opposing loyalties across 19 years without ever fully collapsing either one until the government he was serving collapsed one for him. What followed that collapse, what the 3 years between his exposure and Roy Street produced, is the story of what happens when a man decides that dying in the neighborhood he knows is preferable to living in one he does not. The FBI begged him to disappear. He said no. What those 19 years produced, what the morning on Roy Street finally settled, and what the choice between the neighborhood and the program actually meant, is what this is about. Drop where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of making these, and I read everyone. If you are new here and you want more history like this delivered straight to you, hit subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn and the man who would not leave. The neighborhood came first. It always does in stories like this one. Wilfred Johnson was born on September 29th, 1935, in Canarsie, Brooklyn, one of 5 children raised in a household that was defined, before anything else, by the specific brutality of what his father was. John Johnson was a construction ironworker with the International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Ironworkers, a man of partial Native American heritage, whose exact ancestral nation different sources identify differently, who brought his paycheck home with inconsistency, and who had a relationship with alcohol that turned reliably violent. He beat his wife and his children. He spent what he earned before it could be spent on anything else. His wife, who was Italian American, dealt with the situation the way women in that circumstance sometimes did. She left, periodically, and she came back, periodically, and the children grew up in the specific emotional weather that this kind of household produces in children who are too young to leave and too old to pretend they do not understand what is happening. Wilfred Johnson was not too young for very long. By the age of 9, he was stealing money from cash registers at local businesses. He was caught and arrested, which was his introduction to a relationship with law enforcement that would define the next 50 years of his life in ways that no one involved in that initial incident could have anticipated. By 12, he was running and stealing with enough consistency that the life he was building was already visible in outline, even if its specific eventual shape was not. He was known on the streets of his neighborhood and later on the streets of East New York by names that referred to his appearance: Indian, half-breed, terms that the neighborhood used to mark the thing that his ancestry made visible, and that the organization he was moving toward would eventually use to permanently limit his advancement within it. What he looked like when he was grown was something that retired NYPD intelligence detective Remo Franceschini described with a directness that carried its own authority. He was real stocky, Franceschini said, about 5 feet 9 inches and well over 200 pounds, with a size 21 neck and a gravel voice. You did not want to meet Willie Boy Johnson on the street, Franceschini added, and if you did meet him, you had better have backup ammunition in your pocket, because 6 bullets were not going to stop this man. In approximately 1957, Johnson encountered John Gotti through a street gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys, operating in East New York, Brooklyn. Gotti was approximately 17 years old at the time. Johnson was approximately 22. Gotti was 5 years younger, sharp, hungry, already pointed in the direction that the neighborhood pointed ambitious young men from his specific background. Johnson was older, heavier, already established in the street economy, already carrying the physical presence that would define his organizational usefulness for the next 3 decades. The two men recognized something in each other that produced a bond. The nature of that bond, what it was built on, and what it was capable of surviving, would be tested across 4 decades in ways that neither man could have imagined when they first crossed paths in East New York. Through the Fatico connection, both men found their way to the Bergin Hunt and Fish Social Club in Ozone Park, Queens. Carmine Fatico was the capo regime who ran the crew from that address, a man embedded in the Gambino crime family's operational structure who recruited young men from the surrounding neighborhoods with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for decades. The Bergin was the specific destination that the neighborhood's trajectory pointed toward for a young man without other options and without the kind of temperament that found satisfaction in alternatives. Johnson came in. Gotti came in. They learned the same rhythms, answered to the same man, and built the kind of daily familiarity that the particular routines of that life produce in men who share them over years. The friendship that began on the streets of East New York deepened inside the Bergin's organizational life. It would outlast every arrest and every prison term and every investigation and every moment when the two men were, in the only way that actually mattered, on opposite sides of a line that neither of them could acknowledge openly. It would outlast itself. In the world organized around Gambino family membership, the distinction between an associate and a made man was not a formality. It was the organizing principle of everything that followed from it. An associate could earn. An associate could be trusted with operations, given a gambling territory, assigned to loan collection, included in the crew's daily life at a level that might, from the outside, appear indistinguishable from full membership. But an associate was not a member. And the difference between those two categories, in the specific context of the 1960s and 1970s Gambino family operations, was the difference between having the organization's institutional protection and having only whatever a captain felt like providing on any given day. To be made in the Gambino crime family, a man was required to be of Italian descent on his father's side. This requirement was not negotiable and was not subject to exceptions for demonstrated loyalty, years of service, or accumulated earnings. It was a blood requirement stated plainly and enforced consistently across decades and administrations. Wilfred Johnson's father was part Native American. His mother was Italian American. He came from the wrong side of the line, and the line was not going to move. What this meant in practice was that Johnson occupied a specific and permanent position. He was inside the crew at the level of trust and operational involvement that full membership normally implied, but without the formal standing that converted that trust into institutional protection. He worked as a driver for Gotti and as a bodyguard. He ran loan collection operations alongside Anthony Rampino, a man whose physical features had generated the nickname Tony Roach, and who served as one of Gotti's most reliable enforcers. Johnson and Rampino were Gotti's chief collectors in those years, the men who appeared when money was owed and conversation had already failed to produce it. He also ran a gambling operation that generated what the sources describe as a modest but steady income. He was, in the assessment of people who observed the crew's operations from close proximity, a man who brought in money as well as anyone in the family. The inner circle that Gotti was assembling around himself at the Bergin in the late 1960s and early 1970s included Angelo Ruggiero, who served as Gotti's closest operational associate and who talked at such volume and with such indiscriminate frequency that the nickname Quack Quack required no explanation. It included Gene Gotti, John's brother. It included John Carneglia, who ran an auto salvage operation that served organizational purposes beyond the automotive. It included Rampino, and it included Johnson. Johnson was present for nearly everything that happened inside that circle. He attended the card games at the Bergin. He drove to meetings. He sat in the rooms where operational decisions were made at the level of the crew's daily management. He knew the people, the operations, the internal logic of how the crew worked and who was responsible for what. The depth of his embedding was real, but his formal standing in the organization remained what it had always been, and the gap between what his embedding implied and what his standing confirmed was something he felt and eventually articulated to the people who asked the right questions. He told his FBI handlers in later years that the men around him still treated him as what they had always treated him as, regardless of the years he had put in. They still saw him as a gopher, he said. They still gave him swag to handle. The complaint was not made in a tone of self-pity, but with the flatness of a man identifying a fact he had long since stopped expecting to change. He had done the work. He had done it without the protection the work was supposed to earn him. He had absorbed everything the life required without receiving the formal recognition that the same work earned for a man with a different set of ancestors. The argument for enduring all of this, the ceiling and the resentment, and the permanent adjacency to a standing he could not achieve, was that the organization honored its obligations, that when a man went away, the organization looked after what he left behind, that the loyalty was real because the reciprocal obligation was real. In 1966, Wilfred Johnson found out what the organization's obligations were actually worth. In 1966, Johnson was imprisoned for armed robbery. He was 30 years old. He had 2 infant children and a wife who had stayed through everything the life had produced so far. Carmine Fatico made a promise when Johnson went in. The organization would support the family. The wife and the children would have what they needed. A man who went away without talking was owed that much, and Fatico acknowledged the obligation explicitly. Fatico then broke the promise. Johnson's wife was left without support. She went on welfare. The promise that functioned, in the world Johnson had organized his life around, as the primary justification for absorbing punishment without cooperation, had been made and abandoned in the time it took the initial phone calls to stop coming. He came out of prison into a calculation he had not planned for but could not pretend away. He had kept his end of an arrangement. The arrangement had not been kept for him. The organization had failed to honor the specific obligation that made everything else it asked for defensible. He was returning to serve men who had not done what they said they would do when it cost them something to do it. After his release, the FBI approached him. The timing was calculated on the Bureau's part. An agent identified something in Johnson, a dissatisfaction that was not the ordinary low-level frustration of street life, but something more structural, more rooted in a specific and recent betrayal. The contact was made. Johnson was reluctant. That reluctance was genuine, consistent, and never fully resolved. He was not a man who had decided to cooperate and was looking for the right moment. He was a man being asked to become 2 things at once in a world where being 2 things was punishable by death, who eventually agreed in exchange for the government dropping a set of counterfeiting charges that had accumulated against him. The dropped charges were not the whole of what moved him. He also wanted, in whatever form was available, some satisfaction from the men who had not honored what they owed him. The broken promise was the fault line. The FBI was the instrument that happened to be within reach. The Bureau classified him as a top echelon informant, its highest designation for an embedded source. His code name was Wahoo, assigned by agents who noted his Native American heritage and chose accordingly. His primary handler was Special Agent Martin J. Boland, who would spend years managing a source that refused to follow the operational template. Johnson rarely volunteered information. He answered direct questions. He responded to specific inquiries. He did not reach out to handlers unprompted with material he had decided to provide on his own initiative. The distinction mattered enormously for understanding what he was. Not a man who had chosen a side, but a man managing 2 relationships simultaneously and protecting, in each one, the specific thing he was least willing to lose. From the first conversation with his handlers, Johnson told the FBI that Gotti was not involved in narcotics. He said Gotti respected the organizational prohibition on drug dealing that Carlo Gambino had put in place and that Paul Castellano would eventually continue. These statements were at best significantly incomplete, but Johnson told the FBI what he chose to tell them, and on the subject of John Gotti specifically, he chose to tell them as little as he could manage while still providing enough to maintain his value as a source. He was protecting the man he was also informing on. The two positions were simultaneously and completely true. He held both of them at once, across 19 years, with a discipline that required constant calculation and produced no visible seam. The information Wilfred Johnson provided across 19 years was not uniform in its value, its accuracy, or the degree to which it reflected what he actually knew versus what he had decided it was safe to say. It varied by subject, by period, and by his own running calculation of what each question required him to give up and what he was going to protect, regardless of what he was asked. At its most consequential, his information started a chain of events whose end he did not live to see. In the early hours of May 22nd, 1973, John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and a man named Ralph Gallioni walked into Snoop's Bar and Grill on Castleton Avenue on Staten Island. James McBratney was there. McBratney was an Irish gangster associated with a crew that had been kidnapping connected men across New York City, a series of abductions that had generated fear and fury inside the families whose people had been taken. Carlo Gambino had put a contract out for McBratney's removal, and the three men were assigned to complete it. The plan was to walk McBratney out, to take him somewhere away from witnesses and do it there. McBratney did not cooperate with the plan. He recognized the approach for what it was, resisted, and Gallioni shot him on the bar floor with the witnesses present. The exit the three men made from Snoop's was not the controlled departure that kills someone and leaves no identifiable face behind it. There were witnesses. There were descriptions. Gotti went underground. He stayed away from the Bergin, moved through a shifting set of addresses in the careful way of someone who understood what a bar full of witnesses and a dead body on the floor meant for how much longer he could remain at liberty. Johnson's information helped the authorities find him. Gotti was arrested in early 1974. Roy Cohn, at that period one of the most effective defense attorneys in New York City, negotiated a plea to attempted manslaughter. Gotti received 4 years. On August 8, 1975, he was sentenced and sent to Greenhaven Correctional Facility, approximately 80 miles north of Queens. Wilfred Johnson was already there, serving time on an armed robbery conviction. The two men shared the institution. They played cards together. They circulated through the daily rhythms that confinement imposes on the men inside it. Gotti did not know that the man across the card table had told the government where to find him. Johnson knew. He sat in the game, and he knew. He watched Gotti talk, and he listened, and he absorbed everything without indicating in any way that Gotti detected that he was carrying the specific knowledge of what he had done. Gotti was released on July 28, 1977, having served less than 2 years. He came home to find Carlo Gambino dead and Paul Castellano running the family. The organizational landscape had shifted in his absence. What had not shifted was his standing inside the Bergin crew, which came back to him intact. What he did not come home knowing was who had put him at Greenhaven in the first place. Johnson came home from that institution knowing something that Gotti did not know he knew. The card games had produced nothing that revealed the hidden architecture, and for the time being, the architecture remained entirely hidden. In 1978, Johnson provided his handler Bolin with the location of a hijacking headquarters operated by Paul Vario, a Lucchese family capo. The operation was running through a scrapyard in the outer boroughs, owned by a man named Clyde Brooks. The information was specific, locational, and accurate, the kind of intelligence that moves an investigation from general awareness of criminal activity to a specific operational target. For nearly 2 decades, Wilfred Johnson maintained a divided existence inside a single life. He worked for the Bergin crew. He answered questions for the FBI. He served Gotti and he served Boland, and in both directions he gave enough to maintain the relationship without giving more than he had privately calculated was necessary or safe. The FBI's formal assessment of his value was reflected in Boland's records, which documented the operational complexity of managing a top echelon source who remained embedded in active criminal operations. Johnson was not receiving a salary. He did not collect direct financial compensation from the Bureau for his cooperation. What he received, in specific cases where his information had contributed to the recovery of hijacked goods and insurance companies were offering rewards, was documentation from the Bureau confirming his role. That documentation allowed him to claim the rewards. In one case, the recovery of a large stolen shipment, the payment came to $30,000. He also received once an emergency personal loan of $100 from Boland, which he repaid immediately and on which he declined the informal waiver of interest. The specific difficulty Boland formally documented was that Johnson kept being arrested. He was caught for counterfeiting, for receiving stolen property, for armed robbery a second time. Managing the tension between his continued criminal activity and his informant status required, in Boland's recorded description, single-handed handling by the case agent, who had to contend with the informant being arrested at intervals that no standard administrative guidance could cleanly address. Johnson's value depended on his remaining embedded. Remaining embedded required remaining active, and remaining active in that world meant continuing to do the things that produced arrests. In the summer of 1979, Anthony Plate disappeared from a Miami Beach hotel. Plate had worked for Neil Delacroce in a loan sharking operation based in Miami. He was described by people who had operated near him as exactly the wrong kind of enforcer, someone who jumped on debtors' desks, who threatened to bite chunks from people's flesh, who was indiscriminate in ways that created problems faster than he solved them. Delacroce was facing trial alongside Plate on a separate matter. His concern was specific. The visual of Plate at the defense table was going to complicate what a jury would think. Plate walked out of the hotel one August morning and was never seen again. Shortly afterward, Gotti, Ruggiero, and Johnson returned to the Bergin from Florida with the deep tans of men who had spent time in the sun. Delacroce subsequently received an acquittal in his case. Johnson eventually confirmed to his handlers what the timing had always suggested about his presence in Florida during that period. In November of 1981, Johnson provided what may have been the single most operationally significant piece of information in the full 19-year span. The FBI's Gambino squad, assembled under Special Agent Bruce Mao, was preparing to launch an electronic surveillance operation against Angelo Ruggiero. Before a wiretap could be placed, investigators needed confidence that the target telephone was not already under existing surveillance. Johnson told Boland that Ruggiero's home telephone was clean. On November 9, 1981, the FBI placed the wiretap. The recordings that followed captured Ruggiero and John Gotti discussing heroin transactions with a thoroughness that left very little to interpretation. Paul Castellano, who had inherited Carlo Gambino's absolute prohibition against family members dealing in narcotics, demanded the transcripts. Ruggiero refused to produce them. The standoff between Castellano and the Bergin crew over those tapes became the central organizational crisis of the Gambino family through the early 1980s, building slowly into the specific conditions that gave Gotti his motive for what he did in December of 1985. What he did in December of 1985 was arrange the murder of Paul Castellano outside a Midtown Manhattan steakhouse. Castellano's murder made Gotti boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful organized crime position in the country, a role he would hold publicly and catastrophically until his arrest 5 years later. Johnson had not intended to make his friend boss. He had answered a question about a telephone. The chain that ran from that answer to the December night outside the steakhouse was long, and involved many decisions Johnson had no part in. But the chain had a starting point, and the starting point was a conversation with Martin Boland. To understand what Wilfred Johnson was doing when he was not talking to his FBI handlers, it is necessary to be direct about what his presence in the Bergin crew actually required. He was not an observer recording events from a careful distance. He was an active participant in the enterprise he was providing information about. His value to the Bureau depended on his remaining embedded. Remaining embedded required remaining active, and remaining active in that world meant continuing to participate in the activities that generated the information he was being asked to provide. He drove Gotti to meetings, he collected debts, he provided the physical presence that Gotti's daily operational life required from someone in Johnson's position. He was the man who appeared when conversation had already failed, and the next step was one that required someone willing to take it. The plate situation was the clearest documented example of what his participation meant in practice. Plate was the kind of enforcer who generated problems faster than he solved them, and Delacroix's concern about the trial was both specific and reasonable. The solution arrived in Florida in the summer of 1979, in the particular way that solutions arrived in that world when conventional alternatives had been exhausted. The informant who was answering questions about the crew's violence was simultaneously involved in at least some of the violence about which questions were being asked. His relationship with Gotti across these years was not reducible to the simple categories available for understanding it. He told Boland at one point, with a directness that revealed something about what the arrangement cost him psychologically, that he sometimes loved Gotti and sometimes hated him. He did not elaborate. The statement is the most complete record he left of what the emotional interior of the double life actually felt like. It is more precise than anything more elaborate could have been. The records show that Boland and the handlers who followed him understood that Johnson was protecting Gotti and would not provide material that built directly and personally against him. They worked around it. They asked different questions, developed other lines of investigation, cultivated other sources. Johnson's protection of Gotti was a known variable in how the Bureau managed what Source Wahoo was and was not going to give them. The organization's internal assessment of Johnson's contribution was equally consistent across those years. He was treated as useful, but not as someone whose usefulness had earned him a different standing. He was still the gopher. He was still handling swag. He was still bringing in money, as people would say afterward, as well as anyone in the family, and still receiving the treatment of someone the organization considers subordinate, regardless of what he produced. The resentment this generated was the same fault line that had produced the arrangement in the first place. It had not been repaired by 19 years of service. The broken promise that Fatico made in 1966 had not been addressed by anything that followed it. What no one at the FBI fully anticipated was that the government was going to do to Johnson, in a federal courtroom, and without his consent, what Johnson had spent 19 years carefully avoiding doing to Gotti. The exposure, when it came, would not come from the Gambino squad that had built the Source Wahoo relationship over 2 decades. It would come from a different part of the federal prosecution apparatus, one that had its own timeline and its own calculation of what revealing an FBI informant's identity would cost, a calculation that differed substantially from the one Boland, Mao, Scheer, and Kostler had been living with for nearly 2 decades. The intersection of Johnson's 2 lives was going to be made public. He had spent 19 years preventing it. The government was going to arrange it for him. Diane Giacalone was an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York who had grown up in Ozone Park, Queens, in the same neighborhood where the Bergin Hunt and Fish Social Club operated. She had walked past the Bergin. She knew what the men who gathered there were, and what they had done to the neighborhood they treated as their organizational property. She was not building the Gambino squad's patient, multi-year, comprehensive investigation. She was building her own case, on her own timeline, toward her own prosecution. The FBI's Gambino squad under Bruce Mao did not want her to proceed. Mao's investigation was years in the building. It had informants in place and surveillance operations running and a developing picture of the Gambino family that was moving toward the kind of prosecution Mao believed would be far more durable than what Giacalone had assembled. Her case, from the squad's perspective, was going to force the government's hand too early and force the disclosure of sources before those sources had been fully utilized. Senior FBI officials, including Thomas Shear and James Kostler, fought to stop it. They raised objections through their chain of command. Eastern District U.S. Attorney Raymond Deary supported Giacalone. The objections were overruled. On March 18, 1985, before the indictment was formally announced, Johnson's then-handler Abbott and his supervisor sat down with Giacalone to transfer the Source Wahoo files. These were the documentation of 19 years. The code name, the handlers, the content of what Johnson had provided, the specific operations his cooperation had contributed to. Giacalone's position was that the defense lawyers were legally entitled to receive these materials in discovery, and she intended to provide them voluntarily rather than waiting until they were formally demanded. The FBI agents present were not prepared for what they were hearing. Standard procedure was to delay, to provide discovery only when legally compelled at the last available moment. Every day that an informant's identity was not in the hands of the people the informant had been informing about was a day that could theoretically be used to resolve the situation in ways that protected the source. Giacalone's interpretation was that the disclosure was required and should be made. Abbott told Johnson what was about to happen before it became public. Johnson's response was precise and immediate. He told Abbott he would be killed and his family would be slaughtered. Abbott told him what that meant in practical terms. Take a plea, testify against Gotti, enter the witness protection program. The Bureau would protect him if he moved. If he stayed, the Bureau could not protect him from what staying was going to produce. On March 25, 1985, the grand jury returned an indictment naming 10 defendants on 2 RICO counts, racketeering and conspiracy, facing maximum sentences of 40 years in prison and fines of $50,000 per count. The 10 defendants were John Gotti, Gene Gotti, Neil Della Croce, Armand Della Croce, Charles Carnaglia, John Carnaglia, Anthony Rampino, Nicholas Carozzo, Leonard DeMaria, and Wilfred Johnson. On March the 28th at 4 in the morning, police detectives and Drug Enforcement Administration agents arrived at the Bergin and arrested the defendants found playing cards inside. Johnson was taken in with the others. He was the last to be arraigned. When Giacalone addressed Judge Eugene Nickerson at Johnson's arraignment and argued that he should be denied bail, she explained her reasoning in open court with the defendant present. The reason, she told the judge, was that Johnson had been an FBI informant for over 15 years, including up through the present time. Johnson stood before the judge with his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white, and the tattoos on them, the words true and love, one on each hand, were clearly visible. The FBI subsequently withdrew from the Gotti case, citing administrative and procedural differences. Johnson was placed in a special section of the detention facility. He spent 16 months there. A glass door to the section allowed other inmates to observe and taunt him. On Easter Sunday, his wife was denied visitation. His attorneys argued before the court that the conditions were designed to pressure him into accepting Giacalone's terms. Take the deal, testify, leave. The conditions did not change quickly. He was not broken. He refused to testify against Gotti. He refused to enter the witness protection program. He told everyone who pressed him that he could not testify against John, that John was his friend. The government had done to him what he had spent 19 years refusing to do to Gotti. He was not going to complete the process. The witness protection program that the FBI and the Justice Department were offering Wilfred Johnson in the spring and summer of 1985 was not a vague or undefined alternative. It was a formal federal arrangement that had by that point relocated hundreds of people who had faced exactly the kind of risk Johnson was facing. It moved them to new cities. It gave them new names and, in some cases, new documentation sufficient to construct entirely different personal histories. The people who had wanted them dead could not find them because no one who knew was going to tell them where to look. Accepting the offer would have meant leaving Brooklyn. It would have meant leaving Canarsie, the neighborhood where his wife lived, where his children were being raised, where the streets he had been running since he was 9 years old, stealing from a candy store, were the only geography he had ever chosen to inhabit. It would have meant entering a program that gave a man a different city, a different name, and a different world, in a place he had not chosen and did not know. He said no. Abbott had delivered the message as plainly as a message could be delivered. The disclosure was happening. The files were going to the defense lawyers. The defense lawyers worked for Gotti. The path from those files to Gotti's knowledge was short and direct, and what Gotti would do with that knowledge was not a mystery to anyone who understood the world the men in that courtroom inhabited. Johnson had himself said, within hours of learning what Giacalone was doing, exactly what would happen. He would be killed. His family would be slaughtered. He was not confused about the mechanics of it. He stayed anyway. While he was held in the special detention section awaiting trial, he was caught on a monitored telephone attempting to arrange a drug transaction with his son. He pleaded guilty and received a 1-year sentence. He had already served more than a year in the special section. The sentence was therefore complete and he was released. Jury selection for the trial began in August of 1986. Johnson sat at the defense table as a co-defendant, not as a government witness. He was being prosecuted by the government he had served for 19 years, alongside the man that service had been, in some definitions of the word, designed to bring down. Gotti's defense attorney, Bruce Cutler, attacked the credibility of the prosecution's cooperating witnesses by detailing the crimes each had committed before agreeing to testify. The government's witnesses were criminals whose willingness to appear had a price. Cutler made sure the jury understood what they were before they were witnesses. The prosecution's case was also being undermined from inside the jury box. A man named George Pop had been called for jury service. Poppy had a connection to Bosco Radonjic, who ran the Irish gang known as the Westies, which had worked alongside the Gambinos on various projects over the years. Through Radonjic, Poppy was approached and agreed to sell his vote in the Gotti trial for $60,000. Whatever the other 11 jurors ultimately decided, Poppy's presence meant the verdict would not be a clean conviction. On March 13, 1987, the jury returned its verdict. Gotti and every co-defendant, including Wilfred Johnson, were acquitted of all charges. The American media named what the verdict meant, the Teflon Don. 5 years later, George Pape was convicted of obstruction of justice for his role in the outcome. Johnson was acquitted. He was returned to the neighborhood. He was back in Canarsie with his wife and children, working a construction job, present in the only streets he had ever chosen to inhabit. He was banned from the Bergin. He was not treated with the warmth of the years before his exposure, but he was alive, and Gotti had not acted. He had told Abbott that he could not testify against John. He had not. He had sat through a federal RICO trial as a defendant rather than take the stand against the man he had been providing information about for 19 years. The specific loyalty that had limited his cooperation from the beginning had held even after the government removed the last argument for discretion. The Source Wahoo files, however, were in the hands of Gotti's lawyers, and Gotti had read them. After the acquittal of March 13, 1987, the Source Wahoo files that the Giacalone prosecution had generated were part of the formal discovery materials the government had turned over to the defense. Gotti's lawyers had received them. They had read them. What the files contained was not a broad or general confirmation that Johnson had been an informant. It was a detailed and specific record of what Johnson had provided across 19 years, organized by date and subject, documenting with precision which elements of the Bergin crew's life had reached the FBI through his conversations. The files confirmed that Johnson had led the authorities to Gotti after the McBratney murder in 1973. The man who had been playing cards with Gotti at Green Haven, who had collected debts alongside him through the late 1970s and early 1980s, who had sat at the defense table with him through the Giacalone trial rather than take the stand against him, had been the one who told the government where to find him in the months after Snoop's bar. Gotti had served nearly 2 years at Green Haven because of what Johnson had provided. The files also confirmed that Johnson's information had enabled the FBI's Gambino squad to build the narcotics case against Gene Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero, the case whose tapes had created the crisis between Castellano and the crew. The crisis that eventually produced Castellano's murder, the murder that made Gotti boss. Gotti bided his time. He was running the Gambino family and managing the most publicly visible organized crime profile in the country. He had priorities, and he had a deliberateness about how he sequenced them. But he had read the files. Johnson was back in Canarsie, working construction, present in the streets, reportedly involved again in drug transactions at some level. He was living in the neighborhood. The one he had refused to leave when leaving would have kept him alive. What appears to have accelerated the timeline came from outside the Gambino family's own organizational calculation. Johnson had provided authorities with information about Alphonse Persico, the son of imprisoned Colombo family boss Carmine Persico. That information had reached the Persico camp. Alphonse Persico subsequently raised the subject with the Gambino organization directly. His question, as the sources record it, was essentially what they were waiting for. In the organizational context in which it was asked, the question was not a question, it was an observation. The delay was visible, and the visibility was becoming a problem that extended beyond the Gambino family's internal management. Gotti discussed the situation with Sammy Gravano. The concern he raised was not only about Johnson's past cooperation, but about what a failed attempt on Johnson would produce. If the hit was tried and failed, Johnson would immediately move into federal protection. Everything Johnson had declined to disclose over 19 years, every question he had deflected, and every piece of information he had chosen not to provide would then become accessible to the government. A failed attempt produced a worse outcome than no attempt at all. The solution was to use men Johnson would not recognize as threats before recognition could produce escape. The connection to the Bonanno family provided the answer. Thomas Pitera, known within the Bonanno organization as Tommy Karate, was available to the Gambinos as a favor. His associate Vincent Iatino, known as Kojak, would go with him. Neither man was known to Johnson by face or by association. There would be no recognition and no warning before it was over. In the late summer of 1988, the arrangements were finalized. Johnson continued going to work. He continued coming home. He was in the only place he had ever been willing to be. The morning of August 29th, 1988, was a Tuesday. Johnson walked out of his home on Roy Street in the Flatland section of Brooklyn in the early hours and started toward his car. Pitera and Giattino were positioned near the home. They were men Johnson had never met and would not have recognized as anything beyond strangers. That was the precise operational requirement that had produced their selection. When Johnson walked out and started toward his car, they were ready. He heard the first shot. Everything about what happened next reflects the reflexes that a man develops after decades of living in close proximity to violence. He turned and ran, moving across Roy Street in the direction away from the sound. A man who was 5 feet 9 inches tall and well over 200 pounds and 52 years old was not built for the kind of sprint that creates significant distance in seconds. What he had was the reaction time and the willingness to move without hesitation, the instincts of someone who had spent a life understanding that the first seconds of any violent encounter were the ones that determined everything else. He made it a few feet. Pitera and Giattino fired 19 rounds from a 380 caliber automatic handgun. Johnson was hit once in each thigh. He was hit twice in the back. He was hit at least 6 times in the head. The combination of those wounds brought him down in the street a few feet from where he had started running on Roy Street on a Tuesday morning in late August. When Pitera and Giattino left the scene, they dropped metal spike devices into the street behind them. The spikes were designed to puncture tires and prevent police vehicles from pursuing effectively in the immediate aftermath. The planning that had gone into that morning was precise enough to account for what happened after the shots. Police who arrived at the scene found 19 shell casings from a 380 caliber weapon. The wound documentation reflected the language of a New York City Police Department incident report. Once in each thigh, twice in the back, at least 6 in the head. Johnson was transported and pronounced dead. He was 52 years old. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery and Mausoleum in Middle Village, Queens. His gravestone carries his name, his birth date of September 29th, 1935, and his death date of August 29th, 1988, along with a line about entrusting a precious love unto the Lord. The stone does not reference anything that happened in the 53 years between the dates. Gotti was not charged with Johnson's murder before his own reckoning arrived. In December of 1990, federal agents arrested Gotti at the Ravenite Social Club on a new RICO indictment built on wiretap recordings from inside the club and from a first-floor hallway in an upstairs apartment where the FBI had placed bugs after identifying them as the locations Gotti used for sensitive conversations. Those recordings captured Gotti discussing murders with a directness that made the Giacalone case look like a preliminary exercise. He was convicted on April 2, 1992, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sammy Gravano turned state's evidence in 1991 and testified against Gotti in the 1992 trial. His cooperation included accounts of conversations with Gotti about the Johnson situation, the concern regarding a failed hit, the decision to use Bonanno family men who were unknown to Johnson, the organizational reasoning behind the timeline. Gotti died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri on June 10, 2002. Thomas Pitera was convicted of 6 murders in 1992 and received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Johnson had told Abbott on March 18, 1985, that he would be killed. He had made the prediction before anyone arrived on Roy Street. He had been right. 19 years of information, and what did they produce? In the direct accounting, they produced a picture. The FBI's Gambino squad built its understanding of the Bergin crew's structure and operations on a foundation that included what Source Wahoo had provided: specific arrests, specific investigative targets, the location of Paul Vario's hijacking operation, the evidence that enabled the narcotics case against John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero. All of these were downstream of Johnson's cooperation. The FBI that eventually convicted Gotti in 1992 was working on territory that earlier information had helped map. Johnson's contribution was real and was documented and was substantial in the parts of it that were not also devoted to protecting the man the investigation was most interested in. In the indirect accounting, the picture becomes stranger. The tip about Ruggiero's telephone in November of 1981 launched the surveillance that produced the narcotics tapes. The narcotics tapes created the crisis between Castellano and the Bergin crew. The crisis produced the conditions under which Gotti concluded that Castellano had to be removed. Castellano's murder in December of 1985 made Gotti the boss of the Gambino family. The most publicly visible organized crime figure in American history achieved that position through a chain of events that Johnson's cooperation had set in motion. He had not intended this. He had answered a question about a telephone. What his cooperation did not produce was a conviction of Gotti through the prosecution most directly tied to his own exposure and death. The Giacalone case, which burned Source Wahoo, ended in acquittal on March 13, 1987. The jury had been compromised. The FBI had withdrawn. Johnson himself had refused to testify. The case that cost him his cover, his safety, and ultimately his life, produced no conviction of the man it was designed to convict. He told his handler he could not testify against John. He said John was his friend. He honored that. He sat through a federal RICO trial as a defendant, rather than take the stand. He refused the witness protection program on the day he was told he would be killed. He went back to Canarsie and took a construction job and came home every evening to the streets he had grown up running. He played the hand he had chosen to play, and the hand played itself out on Roy Street on a Tuesday morning in August. The intersection of loyalty and betrayal in Wilfred Johnson's life does not resolve into a clean lesson. He informed. He protected. He participated in violence, he also reported. He refused to run. He was killed anyway. The information he provided was real, and the protection he extended was real, and the refusal was real, and so was the morning on Roy Street. All of it was true, simultaneously. He was, at once, a man who told the government what he chose to tell them about the Gambino family, a man who protected John Gotti from the full implications of that arrangement across 19 years, and a man who chose to stay in Brooklyn knowing precisely what staying was going to produce. He chose the neighborhood. He chose it from the first moment he was offered a way out, and he kept choosing it until the choice ran out. He said it. He stayed.